talking about culturally situated transformation, the field of disability is an interesting case study. The UN Committee on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities has stressed the importance of changing attitudes towards persons with disabilities as an essential step towards lasting reform. A key question for disability reform, as well as culturally situated approaches to special education, is how should we go about changing attitudes towards persons with disability, both in communities with shared cultural frameworks, as well as in communities with diverse cultural frameworks. Dan Vanderplat introduced you to the ideas of how changing attitudes through the 5 attitude stages of ignorance, pity, care, friendship, and co-laborers can equip us to help engender change in our communities. Paul Hebert provides a framework for transformation, the model of how we all start with observational and experiential data that we gather through our lives, demonstrated here by the white circles. From this data, the blue lines represent the way we construct a worldview framework that makes sense of our experience, that gives meaning to the whole, a framework that is compelling to us. In tandem with the construction of this framework, I've added the green stars, which represent how we are all socialized through our families, societies, media, religion, and education into a set of assumptions and attitudes that support our larger frameworks. For example, here we have highlighted how, when we think about disability, certain assumptions and attitudes about perfection or suffering or sovereignty are aligned with a particular constructed worldview. When someone develops a relationship with a person with a disability, that relationship, the person we encounter through that experience, may create experiential data that don't fit into our current frameworks. Eventually, it becomes clear that our framework can no longer make sense of the total observational and experiential data. The result is a paradigm shift that pushes us to reconstruct our frameworks, since we find that the circle connects more of the dots than does the pentagon. And this in turn requires us to shift our assumptions and attitudes. So again, in this example, we see how relationships with people with disabilities lead to a transformation of our worldview frameworks, as well as our assumptions and attitudes about perfection, suffering, and sovereignty. What is often missing in this discourse about transformation is that it assumes that transformation takes place within a broader shared cultural framework. In transformation across culture, we start with the same white dots of observational experiential data. But when divergent cultures construct their worldview frameworks, they are quite different to begin with. For example, here we can broadly consider the different frameworks between the Western world and the Arabic-speaking world. And if we dig beneath the surface, we find very different assumptions and attitudes. We discover different social norms, individualist, collectivist identities, shame, honor, guilt, innocence, fear, power, orientations. And it's here that I would contend that many of our approaches and discourse about transformation are culturally flat. They fail to sufficiently recognize the significant differences in cultural frameworks, assumptions, and attitudes. So what can we do? Agustin Fuentes, a biological anthropologist at Princeton University, discusses the need to situate transformative practices within the frameworks of assumptions in divergent worldviews. He argues that people's behavior has to be enmeshed in a system of belief that makes sense to them and that draws on the imagination and creativity of the community. Where research or best practices may find an answer to a community's problem, it often cannot persuade people in that community to do what is needed unless the solution is connected to local beliefs, traditions, and perceptions. My interest is in working toward transformation in culturally situated, or in my case, Arabic-speaking Islamic settings, where if transformation is framed with Western or weird assumptions, it will not have the social capital to engender change. And this is what I've seen in the field of disability in Lebanon, which has one of the most progressive examples of disability legislation in the Middle East, and yet there continues to be basically no enforcement between what is written in Lebanese law and what is implemented in social practice. As Christ-centered educators, when we think about disability, we start by asking ourselves, what is a biblical theology of disability? We then evaluate how a biblical theology of disability may be similar to or different from a particular culture's view of disability. And finally, we explore how best to connect or find areas of overlap between biblical or kingdom-centered values and the specific cultural values so that we can engender transformation. To use the garden metaphor, we need to plant the right seed in the right soil for transformation to take root and thrive.